This is Shabbat HaGadol Derashah for 2020, that's 5780, delivered the first time due to circumstance as a pre-recorded video. I do hope that it's accessible and engaging, even though the format is unfamiliar and we're not together in person. The subject for this year's Derashah, and I do hope you have the source sheets, they've been circulated, and if we begin this video you don't have them, please obtain them before beginning to listen to the shiur. There are 2 sheets, and the shiur is entitled The Matzah Conundrum, Conflicting Views of a Simple Mitzvah. We're going to discuss the nature and the origin of the obligation of eating matzah on Pesach, which might sound straightforward, but actually is quite complicated. Let's get started. The first 2 sources are from the Torah, and they create a wealth of questions which we'll address as we read the sources. Source 1, V'ovarti ve'eretz Mitzrayim. This is in the lead up to the Exodus, the 12th chapter of Exodus, which precedes the beginning of the story of the Exodus itself, the rules. And in the context of the rules, God addresses the Jewish people through Moshe and Aaron. V'ovarti ve'eretz Mitzrayim, I shall pass through the land of Egypt b'layla hazeh, on that night. V'kesi chol b'chor be'eretz Mitzrayim, and I shall strike all firstborns in the land of Egypt. Me'odom va'ad behemo, from man to beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I shall execute judgment. I am the Lord. This is just for context. And the blood shall be for you as a sign upon the houses where you will be there. This is referring to Pesach Mitzrayim. This was not a performance that was required in subsequent years, but daubing the blood on the post, as it were, as is part of the story of the Exodus. And I shall see the blood, and I shall skip over you, and there will be no plague against you, to destroy when I strike the land of Egypt. I must say that this wasn't the intention, but these words seem very poignant and very distressing at this time. But we carry on and recognise them in context, even though they evoke current feelings. And this day shall be for you as a day of memorial, of testimony, of remembrance. And you shall celebrate it as a festival throughout your generations. As an everlasting statute shall you celebrate it as a festival. That means it isn't going to be just one year. Every year there will be a festival to recall this. And we're going to see exactly what the festival is. This so far is a festival which will replicate the moment of Exodus, which was of course marked by God passing over the houses when the dung was daubed there, the dung blood from the Pesach offering. Now the emboldened words, Shivas yomim matzos tochelu, for 7 days shall you eat matzah. Ach bayom horishin tashbisu sa'om botechem. I'll translate it in the best way I know, which is, however, by the first day you should eliminate leavening from your houses. That means before Pesach begins, you have got to have removed any kind of chometz from your homes. Anyone who eats chometz during Pesach, that soul shall be cut off from Israel, and that takes in from the 1st to the 7th day, all 7 days of the biblical festival. There is a severe penalty of koris, divine excision, for the willful consumption of chometz. Then there's a few verses I've missed out. On the 1st, that means as the first day of Pesach begins, which is which is in the 14th day of the month at evening, meaning when the 14th day is ending as evening comes, what we call Seder night. You shall eat matzos until, it means the end of the 21st day at evening. So the 21st of Nisan will be the 7th day of Pesach, and that's when Pesach ends, the biblical festival as observed today in Israel. You can see straight away that there are some difficulties with these verses. It says Shivas yomim matzos tochelu in verse 15, and these primary sources are all in the English sheet for those who prefer to follow side by side in English. 7 days you shall eat matzahs, but verse Yud Ches 18 says, on the evening following the 14th, i.e. the 15th night, you shall eat matzahs in the evening. And then it says, until the end of the 21st day. That is repetitive. We already knew you had to eat matzahs then, and we're going to have to consider what to do with that. But that is compounded by some parallel verses in Devarim, in the section that we read on the last day of Yom Tov in Re'eh, where the festivals reappear. And again, I'm given some context. Shomoris Chodesh Aviv, observe the spring month, that's Nisan, V'osiso Pesach LaHashem Elokecho, and make Pesach. Again, what Pesach means, celebrate Pesach to the Lord your God. This is referring to later generations. This is post-Exodus. Because in the month of spring, the Lord your God brought you out from Egypt by night. Okay? And you shall slaughter Pesach. Pesach here doesn't mean the Pesach festival. As we use it colloquially, it means the Pesach offering, which can be tzoin uvokar. It can come from the flock. That means it can be a lamb. Uvokar, it can also be a goat. In the place that the Lord shall choose to rest his presence, his name there. The Mishkan, and then later the temple. That's where it will be brought. It's not an offering that can be brought at home. Lo sochal lov chomet shivas yomim tochal lov matzos. You shall not eat upon it chometz for 7 days, you shall eat upon it matzahs. Meaning that once you begin the Pesach offering on the 14th, it's not permitted to eat chometz as a result of this offering, which continues for 7 days. The language is not easy. What are these matzahs? They are lechem oini, poor man's bread, because in haste you came out from the land of Egypt, in order that you shall recall the day of your coming out from the land of Egypt all the days of your life. A verse that is familiar from the Haggadah. And then I missed out a few verses, and the final emboldened verse, Sheishes yomim toicha matzos, you shall eat matzahs for 6 days. Uvayem hashavi'i atzeres laHashem Elokecho, and the 7th day shall be a festival, and atzeres, it means an end point, the concluding festival, we might call it. That's what we call Shavi Shal Pesach, the 7th day of Pesach, to the Lord your God. Lo sasa malocha, you should do no malocha. It's a Yom Tov day where there are the regular work prohibitions. So we have now another problem. Apart from references to eating matzah for 7 days, which appear in verse Gimel, verse 3, in verse 8 it says you should eat matzahs for 6 days. Now, we have eating matzah for 7 days in Shemos, eating matzah on the night of the Seder, which appears to be repetitive because it's incorporated in the 7 days, also in Shemos. We have references to eating matzah for 7 days in Devarim, and then we have a mitzvah to eat matzah for 6 days. Now, in terms of parshonos, in terms of a simple way to read the text in Devarim, the 6 days means 6 more days. Because what has happened in the intervening days is that you've brought your offering, and you've got up in the morning, and you're going to go home, and then for 6 more days, you shall eat matzah, which include the 7th day, which is also a Yom Tov day. So you can see what the text does, and we'll touch on this later. It separates the celebration of Pesach with the offering, v'zovachto Pesach, in verse 2 in Devarim. You shall slaughter the Pesach offering. That's the Pesach celebration. That seems to be distinct from Chag HaMatzos, from the Matzah celebration, which follows from the morning of the first day and for 6 further days, incorporating the 7th day of Yom Tov. But nonetheless, you can see we have quite a number of disparate strands. Is there a mitzvah to eat matzah for 7 days, or only on 1 day? Is there a mitzvah to eat matzah for 6 days? Why is it written in this convoluted and complex way? Now, this is not a new question, and it's addressed in several places in the halachic literature, but it primarily addressed in 2 places, in a Mechilta and in a Gemara Psochim, which we're now going to study. Now, the Mechilta is a very ancient halachic midrash, Talmud-like in its style, and the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael covers large sections of Shemos. That's the book in which these verses in source 1 appear. And the author of this Mechilta, which should be treated as though it were a passage of Gemara in terms of what we do with it, this Mechilta is dealing with these conflicts. It's already noted that we've got a verse that says you should eat matzahs on 1 night. Then it says you should eat matzahs for 7 days, and we've got another verse in Devarim saying you should eat matzahs for 6 days. What do we do with this? So this is Chazal trying to reconcile, and as you're going to see, it doesn't make it any better, but at least they're grappling with a problem. Having noted the verses, we're now in source 3, and this is the key source, and sources 4 and 5 are Rashi's citations of these sources along the relevant verses. Also Rashi troubled by the conflict and apparent dissonance between the verses in Shemos and Devarim. What is the nature of the mitzvah of eating matzah? For how many days, and what is its derivation? Says the Mechilta source 3, Shivas yomim matzos tochelu, you shall eat matzahs for 7 days. Right, that's referring to the verse in Shemos. La'asos horishon chova v'shar hayomim rishus. This appears to suggest, given there is one day on which you have to eat matzahs, ba'erev tochlu matzahs, that suggests that there's only one day of obligation, and the other days are rishus, which means optional. You can choose to eat matzah, as we're going to see. The sources point out, you don't have to eat matzah. You're not allowed to eat chometz. If you want to eat a bread-like food, you need to eat matzah, one that's suitable for Pesach. But you can elect, as many of us do, not to eat matzah. You can eat fruit, vegetables, fish, meat, whatever you want, just not bread. So the coexistence of these verses, says the Mechilta, suggests that one's creating a stronger obligation and the other therefore must be an option. Continues the Mechilta, is that really right to make the first day obligatory and the other days optional? Maybe it means the other way around. Maybe it means, since it's that all the other days are, the first day should be considered as an option, and all the other days are obligatory. So once you have got two stated obligations which are in conflict with each other, why choose one over the other? You could say the first day is an obligation and the other days are optional, or you could say the first day is optional and the other days are obligatory. Says the Mechilta to try to decide which of these to go for. Talmud Lomor Borishoin. On the first day, there's a much stronger imperative in this verse, and if you're looking at the verses, that's verse 18 in the first source. Borishoin ba'arba osar yom lachodesh bo'erev tochlu matzos. On the first day, which we call the first day of Pesach, it means in the evening following the 14th day of the month, you shall eat matzahs. Hakosav kovu choiva. The verse, scripture, creates an obligation, which means the first night is obligatory, but the other days will be optional. Which means, says the Mechilta to conclude this piece, that it's opted for version 1, in which the conflict from in the verses is resolved by saying day 1, i.e. night 1, is an obligation, and the other days are optional, rather than the other way round. Continue, after the 2 dots, about 7 lines down. Shivas yomim matzos tochelu. So now it quotes the same verse. 7 days you shall eat matzah, kosav echad omer shivas yomim matzos tochelu. One verse, that's in Shemos, says, you shall eat matzahs for 7 days. The kosav echad omer sheishes yomim tochal matzos. But another verse in Devarim, as we already noted in source 2, says you should eat matzah for 6 days. How are you going to fulfill both verses, which appear to be saying different things? So it says as follows. Note, go back to source 2, the emboldened verse, verse 8. You shall eat matzah for 7 days, and on the 7th day will be a Yom Tov. Why mention the 7th day specially in this context? It's as though it's saying the 6 days, including the 7th day, you should eat matzah, but we already know the 7th day from other places. So the question of the Mechilta is, Hashvi hazeh b'chlal hoyo v'yotza moitza min haklal. The 7th day is already included in the 6 days. Why then remove it from the set of days on which we already know there is an obligation of some sort to eat matzah? Why mention it separately? It's a redundancy. And this invokes one of the 13 hermeneutical principles of Rabbi Shmuel, who is also the author of this piece in the Mechilta. There are 13 principles which we understand are part of the Sinaitic tradition to tell us how to analyse and extract dinim from the text. And one of them is when an item that's already been mentioned in a set is mentioned separately, it is in order to teach us something about all the other members of the set. And that's called v'yotza motzim min haklal. Something which already has been included is now mentioned separately, taken out of the group as it were. Why would it do that? L'lamed al haklal, to teach you something about all the members of the set, i.e. about every day of Pesach. Ma shvi'i rishus, just as on the seventh day, it never mentions as an obligation to eat matzah, and therefore it's optional. You're not allowed to eat chometz, but it's optional to eat matzah on the seventh day. Av kulon rishus. That must be telling you that all the other members, these other 6 days, meaning from day 2 to day 7, all rishus. It's all optional. There's no absolute obligation to eat matzah. You might have then thought, well, if the seventh day is optional, maybe the first night's also optional. On the whole of Pesach, you can choose not to eat matzah if you wish. Just don't eat chometz. Talmud Loma, that's why the verse is, it goes back to the same reasoning as before. In the verse in Shemos, it says on the night following the 14th, the 15th, there's an obligation, you must eat matzah, and therefore, hakos of kova choiva. The verse, scripture makes an obligation. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that this is an extremely convoluted reasoning. If I can summarize what it seems to be saying, is that we've got 3 verses. One says eat matzah in the evening of the 15th. One says eat matzahs for 7 days, and one says eat matzah for 6 days, or one of which is the 7th day. And by a process which, as far as I can see, no one could reasonably have come up on their own, the Mechilta, troubled by the conflict between these verses and the redundancy which appears within them, splices them all together using one of Rabbi Yishmael's 13 hermeneutical principles to come up with the following. You might have thought you have to eat matzah for all 7 days, like the verse says, but then there's a verse that says you must eat matzahs on the first day, which suggests you only have to eat matzahs then. The other 7 days, including the rest of the first day and the other 6 days, are all optional. How do you deal with the 6 days? Well, the 6 days, it's much the same really. The 6 days mention the 7th day explicitly, and you can learn from the 7th day where there's no particular obligation mentioned in the Torah to eat matzah, although you can't eat chometz. And because it's mentioned separately from the rest of the set, it teaches about the other items in the set that even though you would have imagined there's an obligation, because the text says eat matzah for 7 days, it's actually optional to eat matzah. And what you come out with is what we are familiar with as a halachic construct, which we'll reach at the end of the shiur, which is there is an obligation to abstain from chometz for the whole of Pesach. And there is an obligation to eat matzah on the first night, the Seder night, and in the diaspora on the second night as well, and that is it. But I'm very troubled by how complicated this is to get to what is a very simple construct. More thoughts of that when we get past the Gemara in Psochim. Now, there's a little piece more in the Mechilta. And what the Mechilta is trying to do is to give you what I would say a simple understanding of why the 6 days are mentioned separately. So on the verse in Devarim, which you'll remember says, Sheishes yomim tochal matzos, eat matzah for 6 days, the Mechilta, and we're now 3 lines from the bottom of source 3, says, Dova acher, another reading of this verse, 6 days you shall eat matzah, Kosov echod omer shisha, v'kosov echod omer shiva. One verse says 6, and another verse says 7. Ketzis kaimu shnei mikros halolu. How can we fulfill both verses, i.e. how can we reconcile them? Ela shisha min hachodosh v'shiva min hayoshen. There must be some way in which the 6 days differ from the first, and there is one. The Omer offering was brought on the second day of Pesach in temple times, and from then on it was permitted to eat the new season's grain. And that means in theory you can eat matzah from chodosh, new grain, from days 2 to 7, but you may not eat matzah from chodosh, only from yoshon, only from the old grain on the first day. So one way can reconcile, how do the 6 days differ from the first? Well, whatever matzah you eat, you've got a larger choice of grains available. Now, my thought about this is, and perhaps will become even more obvious when we read the Gemara, is that what the Mechilta is doing is offering a starting point to this discussion that it doesn't mention. And the starting point is a well-established practice that there is no obligation to eat matzah on the other days of Pesach. There's an obligation to avoid chometz, an obligation to eat matzah at Seder night. How do we get these verses? For the Rambam, writing in his introduction to the Talmud, he says that very often we have verses and we have a rabbinic construct, a rabbinic law, which comes to us by some kind of Masorah tradition. And the purpose of the Talmudic literature, and the Mechilta falls into this category, is to draw a line from one to the other, meaning the Mechilta's got an end point, but it hasn't told us what it is. I don't believe that anyone without knowing the end point could ever come up with this very convoluted and, in my view, somewhat unsatisfying reasoning. Now, Rashi in sources 4 and 5, which are the Rashis to sources 1 and 2, really cite these texts in segments, and I decided, in the interest of brevity, that you might like to look at them, but I'm not going to read them. It isn't necessary. Rashi cites this. Rashi is bothered by the inconsistencies in the verses. Rashi's striving to reconcile verses, and he cites sections as a mechilta in his commentaries to Shemos and Devorim. The analogue text to this mechilta, source 3, appears in the Talmud. It's very, very close to the end of Tractate Pesachim, which is the one that deals with Pesach, the last chapter of which deals with eating matzah and the Seder night as we know it today. The earlier chapters right at the beginning deal with searching for chometz and eliminating chometz, and a large bulk of the tractate deals with the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering. But if you look now to source 6, which is halfway down the second column on the first page in the Hebrew, and it's translated in the English sources as well, you'll see a sugya very close to the end of Pesachim, which, as we go through it, you'll see the parallels to the Mechilta of Rabbi Shmuel that we just read in source 3. Omer Rava, Matzah bizman hazeh Derashah or Mora D'Rabbanan. Rava makes a statement, and this fits with our understanding of practice. Today, that means in the post-temple era, the non-temple era, Matzah is a biblical obligation, but Mora is a rabbinic obligation. How so? Doesn't the Torah mention Mora? It does, but it only mentions Mora with respect to the Pesach offering. And so the rabbis instituted a mitzvah to recall that, but it isn't a biblical obligation except when there's a Pesach offering. Umayshno Mora, and the Gemara develops this now. Umayshno Mora dichsev al matzos umrorim. Why does it differ from? Why is Mora different from matzah? Doesn't the verse say about the Korban Pesach in Sefer Bamidbar, you shall eat the Korban Pesach with matzahs and bitter herbs, and Mora? Well, they're both mentioned there. So surely either both are biblical today or both are rabbinic today. Bisman de'ika Pesach yesh Mora, bisman de'leka Pesach leka Mora. As you can see in the verse, why is Mora different? Well, the first stab is that when you have a Pesach offering, there's an obligation to use Mora, and when you don't have a Pesach offering, like today in the non-temple era, there's no Mora. But then the Gemara asks a very obvious question: Matzah nami, harkasiv al matzah sumurim. Then the matzah should be the same. Doesn't the verse say you should eat the Korban Pesach with matzah and moror? Answers the Gemara a very obvious answer. Matzah mahada hoda beikro. Matzah, the verse mentions again somewhere else. Bo erev tochlu matzos. You shall eat matzah on that night. That's the 15th, and there is no association with the Korban Pesach. And as such, there's an independent obligation of eating matzah from the matzah that was eaten together with the Pesach offering. Two obligations. And that does not occur with moror. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, no. That verse tells us that both moror and matzah are tied to the Korban Pesach, and today they're both rabbinic. That's not the halacha, and I've missed out the section of the Gemara that discusses that in more detail because it's too much of a digression. We pick it up after the ellipses, now on the 6th line of the Gemara in source 6. Tanya Kavasi Rava. We have a brisa, that means a text of Mishnaic origin that supports the Amora, the later sage Rava's position. Sheishes yomim tocha matzos uvayom hashavi'i atzeres lashem elokecha. It quotes our verse in Devorim that we saw in source 2. For 6 days you shall eat matzahs, and on the 7th day is atzeres to the Lord your God. Ma shavi'i rishus, and this you'll see now is very familiar. It's echoing the language and usage of the Mechilta. Ma shavi'i rishus, just as the 7th day is optional, because the verse never mentions an obligation to eat matzah specifically on the 7th day. Av sheishes yomim rishus, so too the other days are. The other 6 days are optional, meaning there's an option to eat matzah on days 2 to 7, and you can see that's the same as the Mechilta. And in fact, it continues to develop the ideas in the same line as the Mechilta. My time, what's the reason? How do you get that reasoning? It's an item that's already been incorporated. The 6 days include the seventh, and yet the seventh day is mentioned separately. Why is it removed from the set? To teach something about all the items in the set. This is exactly analogous to the Mechilta. It doesn't come out as it mentioned separately from those other members of the set to learn something about itself. It's mentioned separately to teach us about every item in the set. And what is that? That on the seventh day, since matzah is optional, it must be optional on the 6 days too. And it does the same thing. Maybe that means that on the first night it's also optional. Talmud loimo. Therefore the verse says, Al matzos umrom yochaluhu. It doesn't use the same verse as the Mechilta. Upon matzahs, amor, you should eat it. But now we've got a problem, because if that's the verse that's being used, what do we do when there's no temple? That would only work when the temple's standing, when there's a Pesach offering, and we have to eat Pesach matzah tomorrow with it. And how do we know that there is an obligation to eat matzah biblically on the first night of Pesach when there is no Pesach offering? Talmud loimo bo erev toichlu matzah. It's a kos of koiva choiva. That the verse is in Shemois, in the evening, that means on the 15th, you shall eat matzahs. The Torah provides a fixed obligation. And you can see that although it's in the context of a different discussion, the reasoning is almost identical. We've got the 6 days, the seventh day, the mitzvah to eat, and it suggests that that it's a reshus, it's optional to eat matzah on days 6 to 7, but there is an obligation, whether in temple or non-temple times, on the first night, on the 15th, what we call Seder night, to eat matzahs. So you can see that the reasoning is identical, and all that Chazal come up with to deal with these convoluted, these contradictions in the verse is a convoluted reasoning, which appears both in the Mechilta and in the Bavli. Now Rashi Saul 7 explains a little, but I've already covered it. Marshavi Rushus. Why does the Gemara assume that the seventh day is optional? That was the starting point of the seventh day is taken out of the set to learn back into the other items of the set. How do we know this? Because it says the seventh day is a festival. But it does not mention eating matzahs. It removes it from the category of all the others. It's already included in the 6 days. It's mentioned separately. So too, if the seventh day is an option to eat matzah, it will be optional on the other days. Because if one chooses, one can eat meat with no bread. Meat's just an example. It could be any food, and bread here doesn't mean soft bread, it means matzah. Oilisanos, you can fast, you can abstain altogether. There's only an obligation, which means Rashi validates our reading. We have two parallel sugyas. And again, I'll say that although this is not admitted to in the Gemara, and the Meforshim don't really say this either, in my view, both the Gemara and the Mechilta have a starting point, a la Rambam, that they've got the verses, and here they've got a whole mishmash of conflicting verses, and on the other side they've got a halachic construct, which is there's an obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach, and the rest of Pesach there's no obligation to eat matzah, just to abstain from chometz, and they've got to somehow or other, by some clever mechanism, bring the two together. And that's what they've done in the Mechilta and the Bavli. Now, I don't normally do this, but here's an Achron, a much later source, Totamim, written a bit more than 100 years ago. Totamim, Baruch Halevi Epstein, interesting thinker, who elaborates a little bit and actually explains quite helpfully some of the background in this source. It's actually on the Gemara in source 6 and it's source 8. Rotsaloma, this means, Ma shavi'i rushus lechel matzah. Just as on the seventh day, it is optional to eat matzah, because it mentions the seventh day and it says it's atzeres, a yom tov, but it does not mention an obligation explicitly to eat matzah. Shari hoitzim and aklal, it's taken it out of the category. We've said this several times. So too, all 6 days, if one does not wish to eat bread, which means matzah, that is one's right to do so. And the reason this is a valid way of juxtaposing the verses, as it were, and reconciling them, is because we've already got a verse that says you should eat matzah for 7 days. And yet, Atzeres, the seventh day, is mentioned separately. V'yotzim min haklal, Bahai, and if you're using the Hebrew source, we're just about to go onto the second sheet. Bahai kro d'sheis yom kasiv. It's already included in the 6 days. Lamed shehu rishus, and it's removed from that to tell you what's the distinguishing feature of the seventh day that you'll then read back into the other days. It's rishus, it's optional. V'lo lelamed al atzmo levadoi. It's not teaching you only about itself, to tell you about every item in the set. It's just expanding it, make it a little more accessible. Dainu shivas yomim, the 7 days. This is one of the 13 hermeneutical principles with which the Torah is expounded, perhaps more correctly through which dinim are extracted. And here, that's the end, that's much as we've said. Umitam drosha zoi. And because of this drosha, i.e. because of the halachic outcome, mitzvah to eat matzah on the first night and in the diaspora on the second night, option to eat matzah on the others as long as you avoid chometz. Mitam drosha zoib, the reasoning behind this drosha, or this drosha gives the reason for ein mevorachin al achilas matzah b'chol yemei Pesach. We don't make a bracha when we eat matzah on the other days of Pesach. When you eat matzah for breakfast on the third day of Pesach, you do not make a bracha al achilas matzah. You only make that bracha at Seder night. You have to make hamotzi lechem and oretz, but that's what we do before eating bread or any bread-like foods throughout the year. But the bracha of al achilas matzah is not said throughout the days of Pesach. Mishum de ein chiyuv lechol matzah rak be'alayla horishon Ubeleil Yom Tov Beishal Golis, because there is only an obligation to eat matzah on the first night and in the second night in the diaspora, where we replicate the practices of the first night. V'lokumoy b'sukkos, and it's not like sukkah shemavorachim kol yom al yeshiva sukkah. We say the bracha every day when we dwell in the sukkah. Mishum d'chol yom mitzvah miyuchedes hi lo sheves b'sukkah, because there is an individual mitzvah every day. It's a completely different construct. We assume that the Torah Tamim was asked the question and therefore chose to answer it in the form of a comparison. So far, so unclear. We can see what Chazal do with this, but I have always been really troubled by this structure. If we were going to be entirely honest, we find that what the rabbis have done is tie themselves in knots with a whole load of conflicting verses in order to preserve a halachic construct that they knew existed already, but didn't seem to admit to in their analysis. But I think there is another way to understand this which might sort it out. It doesn't conflict with Chazal, it might sit side by side with it, through which we can resolve some of the difficulties in the verses. Our starting point is a Chizkuni. The Chizkuni is quite an early Rishon, medieval commentator, who mostly comments on Rashi. He says something rather interesting. This is a piece drawn from the middle of the Chizkuni's commentary in the 12th parak of Shemos. He toys with the various ideas. He says, perhaps if one's false, one could say the following. There are constructs, it means mitzvahs, requirements of the Torah, that we receive reward if we perform them, and we are punished if we do not perform them. For example, Matzah, Melel Rishon Ve'elech. Right, I think that's a printing mistake. It means Matzah at Seder night. You have an obligation to eat Matzah, and you have an obligation to eat Matzah, which is a live, real obligation, and you get reward for doing it, and if you don't do it, presumably there's some kind of consequence. There's no news there. And there are things that one does not receive reward for doing them, nor punishment for not doing them. For example, eating matzah after the first night on Pesach. Look what the Chizkuni says. He describes it as something for which one does not perform a mitzvah, nor is one punished for failing to do. He's creating a new category to resolve our problem. Now, so far we've understood reshus to mean optional. I can choose if I want to eat matzah. If I feel like a bread-based meal, I need to eat kosher Pesach matzah. But I can also elect to eat something else, providing it isn't chometz. He's creating a new category. Mikol mokim matzahs shivas yomim matzahs tochelu. When it comes to matzahs, There's a verse that says, eat matzahs for 7 days. And to be honest, that verse has been ignored because all the analysis, except he removed it from existence, because there is no obligation, according to the rabbis, to eat matzah for 7 days. There's an obligation to avoid chametz for 7 days, and there's an obligation to eat matzah on the first night. But says the Chizkuni, what do we do with the pshat? What about the simple reading of the verse? What happened to the verse is there must be some way to fulfill that verse, and therefore, as it were, put it back in place. Otherwise, why did the Torah say it in the first place? Koloima, im ochal matzah kol shivas hayomim, if you eat matzah throughout the 7 days after the first night, kayim haposek zeh shal shivas yomim matzah is teichelu. You can fulfill the verse of 7 days you should eat matzah. So he's got a new category, fulfillment of verse. At the pshat level, at the simple reading level, there has to be some purpose in the verse. It can't just be to be eliminated by the other verses, because what the other verses effectively do is that say, according to the rabbis, is that even though the text says Shivas Yomim Matzahs Toichel, you should eat matzahs for 7 days, you don't have to eat matzahs for 7 days. But why is the verse there in the first place? The curious thing is that none of the early sources ask this question. The Chizkuni is the first person to really flag this question. It just seems to us such an obvious question. Okay, I can accept Chazal. We have a long-standing, reliable Masorah tradition that that's the obligation to eat matzah on the first night and not on the others, just avoid chametz. And if you want to eat matzah, it's your choice. But then there's an unanswered question. Why write the Torah this way? The Chizkuni is the first person who seems to be addressing this question. Shivas Yom Damal, because you can, as you makayim the posuk, you can fulfill a verse. But what does it mean to fulfill a verse? Is it a mitzvah? He says not. Is it an option? Well, if it's an option, then how can you fulfill a verse if you choose to do it? The Chizkuni is introducing a new category, a category of mitzvahs which we have touched upon before, but is not necessarily familiar. We have a mitzvah chiyuvis. That means there is an obligation to perform a mitzvah at a certain time in a certain way. Examples on Matzah at the Seder night, shofar on Rosh Hashanah, lulav on Sukkos, tefillin. These are mitzvahs chiyuvios, an obligation to perform the mitzvah, and you get reward for doing it, and presumably there is some consequence of failing to do it. But the Chizkuni is beginning to develop a new idea. There's a second category, a lower level, if you like. It's called, and we're going to use this phrase now, mitzvah reshuyos. It's a mitzvah that is optional. That means you don't have to do it. But if you do it, you fulfill a mitzvah. You say, well, maybe I've made this up to deal with this problem. The fact is there are several other examples. Here are two. The first is tzitzis. Although it is customary for men to elect to take a four-cornered garment and to put tzitzis on it to fulfill the Torah's requirement, biblically you only have to put tzitzis on a garment if it meets the stipulations, which is a certain size and shape, which is 4 corners. Then a man has to wear tzitzis on the garment and fails to perform mitzvah otherwise. But if you do fulfill that mitzvah, even though it is an optional mitzvah, I do not have to go out and buy a 4-corner garment on which to put tzitzis, even though we mostly have elected to do so, then I fulfill a mitzvah nonetheless. I fulfill the verses, I fulfill the mitzvah. That's called an optional mitzvah, a mitzvah reshuyos. The second example is shechita. When a shochet shechs an animal, he says the brocha, asher kedeshonu b'mitzvah yisov v'tzivonu, that we've commanded us, it's a mitzvah, al hashchita, concerning the shechita. This is not an obligatory mitzvah. We don't have to go out each day and shecht an animal, like there's an obligation to wear tefillin for men each day, like there's an obligation to shake a lulav or to blow shofar and so on. But when we fulfill the mitzvah, when we do it, elect to do it, if we're going to kill an animal for food, we have to do it a certain way and make a brocha, and we fulfill a biblical mitzvah in so doing. What Chizkuni is suggesting is that we can fulfill the pshat, the straightforward reading of the verses, which has effectively been removed from existence by the rabbinic analysis, by eating matzah and fulfilling what might recall an optional mitzvah. We need to develop that idea further. So here's a Tosfos. The Tosfos is discussing what happens if someone fails to say a particular prayer. They forget to daven shacharis, or they're unwell and they're not able to. Mincha and Mariv and so on. And the rabbis introduce a concept of tefillas tashlumin. That means that they are to, at the next prayer, the person who missed the tefillah, the Amidah, says a second Amidah. So if you miss shacharis Amidah for whatever reason, then after mincha, you say the regular mincha amida, you say a further amida to make up for the lost one. You can only do it once, you can't back them up and say 20 at once. And if you miss more than one, well then you can only do 2, but that's what you do. At the next prayer, you add a second amida to cover, as it were, to replace the one that you lost. So the Gemara is considering the following question. If you forget to daven Mariv, should you say 2 amidas at Shacharis? So why does this differ? Because while Shacharis and Mincha are unquestionably obligations, the Talmud engages in a lengthy conversation as whether Mariv is actually a Reshus, optional, or Choiva, an obligation. We have long treated it as an obligation, but the origin of that discussion is since the offerings map to our prayers, there was an offering in the morning, the Tomid Shal Shachar, the morning offering. There was the Tomid Shal Ben Arbaim, the afternoon public offering. But in the evening, the leftovers were burnt on the altar, but there was no specific offering, which means maybe the prayer is optional. In that context, the Talmud posits that someone who misses Mariv should say 2 Shacharis Amidas. And that's the starting point for this Tosfos. Im Toima, the end of the first line of Tosfos. If you want to say, doesn't Rav say further on, Tefillas Arav Reshus? Rav holds that Tefillas Arav Mariv is optional. If it's optional, why do you have to replace an optional prayer at Shacharis? So you didn't say it one day. That's what you would do with an optional prayer. I didn't do it one day. V'oid kashan is a further question. To Omelakom, because it says further on, if one forgot to include Yalev Yova on Rosh Chodesh in one's Amida, what should you do? If you miss it out of Shacharis and you don't go back to the right point, you have to say the Amida again. And the same at Mincha. What about Mariv? Answer Ein Machzir Mosa. You don't have to repeat the Amida if you forget Yalev Yova at Mariv on Rosh Chodesh. Why is that? Mishum de Ein Mekachin is a Chodesh Balaylo. Because they never say in temple times where they waited for witnesses to come, and post-temple times too, in the Yavna era and beyond, the rabbis would never declare the moon sanctified at night. It was a daytime requirement, and that means notionally it was never really Rosh Chodesh formally at night. And because of that, if you happen to miss that Yalav Yova and Mariv on Rosh Chodesh, then you don't have to repeat your Amida. Because they did not sanctify the moon at night. Why do you need these reasons? Simply say the Mariv is optional. And so I said the wrong Mariv without Yalav Yova. I forgot that it was Rosh Chodesh. But since Mariv is anyway optional, at least according to Rav, why do I need even to worry? Just say, well, do you know why I haven't got to repeat Mariv? Because it's optional. Do you know why I haven't got to say a second Shacharis Amida if I forget Mariv altogether? Because it's optional. Why doesn't the Gemara give those answers, asked Tosfos? The Yesh Loima, we can answer. When we say that Mariv is optional, and we're using like now, it's in inverted commas, optional, it's only relative to other mitzvahs. It's not completely optional. Vehi overes. It's when it's passing, meaning that I now have a situation where the mitzvah, which is optional, might pass, and I have to choose between doing an obligatory mitzvah, a choiva, or rishus. Then obviously I will choose the mitzvah if I can only do one within the time frame, the one that's obligatory, and I will not do the one that is optional. Then you will say, well, push aside Mariv and do the more important thing. But for nothing at all, for no particular reason, ein lo levatol, you're not allowed to negate it or cancel it. Tosfos has contributed something very, very interesting here, which is going to be critical in unravelling this problem. Tosfos is saying, a little like Chizkuni, that whenever the rabbis say reshus, optional, about a mitzvah, and we've got 2 examples now in the literature we're studying. One is about Mariv, the Amida, and that's within the view of Rav, which we may not follow la halacha, but within the view of Rav. Even when Rav holds Reshus, he says Reshus is optional, he doesn't mean you can choose not to do it. It means if faced with a choice between a real obligation and this obligation, you would always do the real one. But it doesn't mean you should just ignore it for no reason. You still should do it. So it's a relative Reshus rather than an absolute Reshus. And that's the distinction that Tosfos has made. It's not as developed in the Chizkuni, But look at what the Vilna Gaon does with this. Now, the Matzah Rav is a collection of the practices of the Vilna Gaon written by his students, but it's regarded as a reliable record of the Vilna Gaon's halachic worldview. And in source 11 is an extract from the Matzah Rav, which are the kind of practices of the Vilna Gaon. Section Kuf Pei Hey 185. Shivas Yomim Tochal Matzos. 7 days, you quote our verse, 7 days you eat matzahs. Kol Shiva Mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to eat matzah all 7 days. The Vilna Gaon is not willing to relinquish the pshat. The Torah says it might, in the halachic construct, be superseded by another mitzvah, but ultimately the Torah says eat matzah for 7 days. He said there's still a mitzvah to eat it. It's only considered optional relative to the obligation of the first night. It's pretty much exactly quoting the Tosfos, except plugging in matzah instead of mariv. It's only a relative with respect to the absolute obligation of eating matzah on Seder night. It's a reshus, but it's not a real reshus. It's not absolutely optional. Shichova, but that's a real obligation on the first night. Umitzvah lagabi chova reshus korean. The rabbis use the word reshus, optional, because it is only optional, with respect to a full-blown obligation. Af al pk mitzvah de'oraisahu. It's still a biblical obligation. That differs from the Chizkuni, which he's got a weaker language. It's a fulfillment of a verse. Perhaps he means a thematic fulfillment of the verse. The Vilna Gaon holds as a biblical mitzvah to eat matzah every day, but it's a mitzvah reshuyus. It's an optional mitzvah, meaning there's no penalty for not doing it, but you fulfill a mitzvah when you do it. And now we understand why the verses are written this way. Mitzvahs achilas matzah, and how did that manifest in the Vilna Gaon's practice? He was particularly wedded to this mitzvah. The mitzvah of eating matzah, kol shiva, all day, all 7 days. And on the last day, he lived in diaspora, that's the 8th day, he would eat Suda Shlishis, the third meal, even though he would not eat 3 meals, meaning the Rambam holds that you're supposed to eat Shalosh Shudas, the third meal, on weekday Yom Tov, as well as Shabbos. The normative halacha is not like the Rambam, we only do it on Shabbos, not on weekday Yom Tov. The Gror held like the normative halacha, not like the Rambam, but he made an exception on Yom Tov Achron, on the last day of Pesach. Why? Because he was so excited, it was so precious to him, and the time is passing, another hour, and there'll be no option. So he wanted to have an extra opportunity. Some people have heard me refer to this last meal on the last day of Pesach as a Gror Suda. That's what we call it at home. That we have Shalosh Shudas on the last day of Pesach, even when it's on a weekday, in order to fulfill the practice of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon has now moved our conversation. He's really saying the same as the Chizkuni, but more strongly. He's drawn, however, on the language and usage and typology provided us by the Tosfos in source 10. We now have actions which are entirely obligatory. I chose this jacket to wear while giving this shirt. I could have chosen another one. It's a meaningless choice. I can do what I like. That's not what Reshus means with respect to matzah. Reshus means the next level up. There is a biblical obligation to eat matzah, but it's optional, and you can do it if you can do it if you're able. And it's a good thing to do it, but it's still not the higher level, which is where there's an obligation to do it, an absolute obligation like the other obligations we mentioned, and failing to do so without good reason would incur some kind of penalty. So now we understand there's a halachic discourse going round about the comparison. Yes, in terms of absolute obligation, we need to compare the verses to learn that only the first night is obligatory, because the text says in the strongest language, on the first, that means the first day, the day which is as the evening of the 14th finishes, in the evening you must eat matzahs. That puts it in a category of its own. It separates it, according to Rav in the Gemara in Pesachim in Sol 6, from the other, from Moror, and it creates an independent obligation of eating matzah even when there's no temple. It creates an absolute obligation, in which case, what's the real answer? The 7 other days are reshus, meaning there is a mitzvah to eat matzah, but of a lower level, one that you fulfill when you eat it, but one for which there is no consequence if you do not. And that really answers our question and enables the mechilta to make a little more sense. There's a bit more of this. This way of thinking, I'm grateful. I've drawn on a book called Pshuta Shel Mikra, of the late Rav Yehuda Kuperman. And this is entirely asking the question, as he puts it, not the how, what's the mechanism for learning? We know that already, but the madur, why? Why is the text written this way rather than a simpler way? It's an old question. We might accept the rabbinic interpretation of ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, that it really means compensation rather than poking someone's eye out. But then the question, burning question, why write ayin tachas ayin? Why not write kesef tachas ayin? Money in place of an eye, compensation. Those questions are not asked in the medieval period very often. And that's the question that we're trying to ask in this shiur. And it's put into focus by Rav Kuperman's piece in source 12, Imishol HaShoyel a Midrash Chazal Zeh. If someone will ask about the Midrash, that's the Mechilta and the Gemara that we saw in sources 3 and 6. Hari Efsha Hoyel Histapik B'Posel Berav Tochel Matzahs Bilvad. The only doubt really will be about the verse that says in the evening you should eat matzahs. Im omnom ein kol mitzvah matzah b'shah yomim kafisha omnom nikva halacha. If it's true, we've got that verse, that's fine. We know what that does, and it gives us, we can map that verse to our obligations, that we'll sit at Seder night and eat matzah. But actually, what about all the other days? Given we know what how the halacha is fixed. L'shema kosva Torah shiva v'achar kach shisha. Why did the Torah bother to write 7 and then 6? He asks a question which appears almost heretical, that if you accept the rabbinic analysis in the Mechilta and the Gemara in sources 3 and 6, the verses don't do anything. All it actually does is create, we know there's from somewhere else an obligation to avoid chametz, and all it says is eat matzah on the first night. Why have the rest of it? What do those verses actually do? Because what the second verse does is completely cancel out the first. And the bit in brackets, and I rather like this, and you might too, it was a footnote in Rav Kuperman's book, Al derech hachidud. If you really want to kind of poke harder, what you get, efshel lish'oil, you could ask the question, Mosai al pi ha'arit matika. How through the instrument of arithmetic shall Torah of the Torah shiva plus shisha equals 0? How can you get 7 plus 6 equals 0? What Rav Kuperman has said is that if you accept the rabbinic literature at face value, the verse you should eat matzahs on that night is used up. But the other verses, you put the 7 and the 6 together and you get nothing, no obligations at all. So the most obvious question is, well, just don't write either of them. The rabbis seem to have made the problem worse, although we've now really answered it. Midrash halacha. The Halachic literature do address this question, and they have a number of answers, one of which we saw earlier in the Mechilta and was quoted in one of the Rashes in source 4 that we didn't read, which is that the 6 days differ from the 7th in that 6 days you can eat the chodosh, the new grain, after the barley offerings bought, but it's obscure and still doesn't seem to satisfy all of the questions. We continue with the Rav Kuperman in the second paragraph on the top of the final column. We've come back now and asked the simple question. What is the simple reading of the verse? What's it for? You can't say these verses in the Torah aren't there for anything. Whatever you say, the Torah says you should eat matzah for 7 or 6 days. The Gra answers, Kol Shiva Mitzvah. Ve'ena Korilo Rishus El Lagabi Laila Rishon Shu Choyva or Mitzvah Lagabi Choyva Rishus Korilo Aval PK Mitzvah Derashah. This is a citation from our source 11. I'll just remind you, it means all 7 days there's a mitzvah, and it's only called, as it were, an option relative to the first night obligation, which is a full-on obligation, and a mitzvah with respect to something which is a chova, a real obligation, or a lower level obligation. That lower level obligation is called reshus, optional, but it is still biblical. Harei pshuta shel mikra melamed. The simple reading of the verse teaches mitzvah deraisa, a biblical mitzvah, shahamekayma zoichel schar al kim mitzvah deraisa. Someone who fulfills it receives reward for fulfilling the biblical obligation. But it's not the same level as reward, it's not the same type of obligation. And what the Gra and the Chizkuni and the Tosfos and Rav Kuperman have been able to do is resolve why these verses are there at all. A question the Mechilta doesn't seem to answer, unless you understand that the word Rishus does not mean totally optional. The difficulty, of course, is that Rashi says, if you want, you can eat meat and not bread. What they're really saying is that, of course, you can eat meat, But it would be better to eat matzah because by so doing, you can fulfill a biblical mitzvah. But that is, as they say elsewhere, a bit of a kvetch. Continue with the Rav Kookman, going back to the end of the 5th line of the 2nd paragraph, which is the first new paragraph on the 2nd column of the 2nd sheet. The simple reading of the verse teaches a biblical mitzvah. Someone who fulfills it receives reward for fulfilling a biblical mitzvah. And actually, this idea originates in the Chizkuni, who preceded the Vilna Gaon by hundreds of years. Shitas HaChizkuni Gra, the view of the Chizkuni and the Gra, Yechol listamik al etzem HaKaviyah shel HaTorah atzmo, sheyesh lo mitzvah aseh afil b'miskares tariag, she'HaTorah kova oison karashus. And what they teach us, and is enormously helpful, and is that it creates a recognition. There is a new category of mitzvahs. They're biblical. They fit within the loose category of the Ta'ariyag of the 630 mitzvahs. This is, if you like, a subcategory, a subspecies of the obligation to eat matzah on Pesach, which has various manifestations. One is a full-on obligation, a chova, to eat it at Seder night, but another is a mitzvah shus, an optional mitzvah to eat it on the other days. And this is borne out by the halachic constructs that follow. We're near the end now. In source 13, you have the Rambam Hilches Chometz Matzah. Mitzvahs aseh min haTorah le'echol matzah b'leil chamisha oso. There's a biblical mitzvah in the Torah to eat matzah on the night of the 15th Shneim, as the verse says. Ba'erev tochel matzah. There's no surprise which verse he quotes. B'chol mokum v'chol zman. And this mitzvah applies in all places and all times. That's to refute the view of Rav Ada bar Acha in the Gemara, who said that matzah was tied to the Pesach offering, and therefore it was only rabbinic in non-temple times. We don't hold like that, we hold like Rava. It's not contingent on the Korban Pesach, it is an independent mitzvah. You can do it all night. Aval b'shar haregel, now the key bit. Achilas matzah reshus. Eating matzah is optional. Rotza oichel matzah, rotza oichel oirez odochin. Ironically, the examples he gives, you can eat matzah if you wish, or if you don't, you can eat rice, or dochen, or porridge, obviously made of Pesachtic ingredients, okloyes, or seeds, operis, or fruits. Now, we know that the Rambam doesn't come from a kitnius world. He just gives examples of common food that aren't chometz. Aval belech hamisha also belvad chova umisha ochel kazayas yatzidei chavoso. But when it comes to the 15th, alone is a chova, an obligation, and when he eats a kazayas, when one eats a kazayas of matzah, meaning an olive's bulk, that's just telling you how much you have to eat. It's a different shiur. Yatzidei chavoso, one is fulfill one's obligation. I'd like to make a diuk, an inference from this Rambam. First of all, the Rambam has already said the last line seems to be entirely redundant. Aval beleil chamisha osa bilvad chova. There's an obligation only on the 15th night. We know that already. Why does the Rambam say it? Because I want to say he says chova. It's the only time there's a chova. That doesn't preclude the possibility of reshus. The Rambam goes back over to say that's all relative. But in reality, there may not be a chova on the other days, but there is a reshus. And furthermore, he says, the Rambam is uncharacteristically verbose. Ordinarily, the Rambam would say, Ushi'uroi b'kazayis. Its measure is a kazayis. He says, one has eaten a kazayis, one's fulfilled one's choiv. But that's the reason he's writing like this, I believe, is because he is validating the prospect of continuing to eat. You continue to eat. Some people actually say that the more matzah you eat on Seder, you can still fulfill the choiv. That is not something we've just explored here, but I'm suggesting the Rambam constructs the language to allow for the possibility that you can continue fulfilling some sort of mitzvah, not a choiv. Otherwise he would not have repeated this phrase, nor would he have written the shiur, or the volume, in this obscure way. He could have just said after ushi'uro b'kazayis, the measure is a kazayis, but by saying on the 15th night only is a choiv, suggests to me there are obligations that can go beyond that, but it's not a chova, it's a different level of obligation, like we've seen in the Gra, like we've seen validated by the reasoning of Tosfos. And once you've eaten the kazayis, you've done your chov, but you can still fulfill another mitzvah by eating more. So you might just refute, this is my own. And the mitzvah itself, very briefly in the Shulchan Aruch, Ein chiyuv achilas matzah ela b'leil rishon bilvad. It's much briefer, says the Shulchan Aruch. The only obligation of eating matzah is on the first night. Says the Mishnah Brura, writing in the late 19th century, unsurprisingly, because he collates the various practices. And in Lithuania, with Jewish Lithuania, he was actually in Latvia, these are practices of Vilna Gaon were well known. B'shem Agro Kosvoi. They write in the name of the Vilna Gaon, the al kol ponem mitzvah ikar lechol matzah kol shiva ela she'ein chiyuv. There is an obligation to eat matzah all 7 days, but it's not an obligation, which means it's found its way to the halachics also as well. There is an obligation, but it's not a chiyuv. It's a different type of obligation, as we've now discussed extensively. And so we found a way of validating the reason in Chazal. Chazal are only talking about the full choiv. At the choiv level, the 6 and 7 cancel each other out. But the reason it's written like this is because for 7 days there is a mitzvah to eat matzah. And you've got to make sure you understand it's a reshus. So the 7th day has to be excluded from the klal to learn back that it's a reshus. But reshus here, based on Tosfos, based on the Chizkuni, based on the Gror, and based on, to some degree, our need to validate some proper reading in the verse that is not otherwise there. Otherwise, as Cooperman says, you could put the two verses together and then you could just delete both of them. You don't need them. Allows us to understand the pshat, read the verses in a cogent way, and still validate the reasoning of the rabbis that appear in Source 3 in the Mechilta and Source 6 in the Gemara and Pesachim. I have one more thing to add to this, which I mentioned at the beginning, perhaps a bit cryptically, that we have Chag HaPesach, and that's associated with the Korban Pesach. That was the festival of Korban Pesach. It's the festival of membership. Every adult each year had to be part of a group that bringing a Pesach offering. It's a membership ritual that for willful evasion of this mitzvah, there's a serious punishment. It's a membership ritual, and it replicates the moment at which God intervened and brought them out of Egypt. There's also Chag HaMatzos, and although in our tefillah, and although often colloquially we tend to confuse them, it looks as though they are two different festivals. They may have different origins, but they come together. We have a Pesach which is Chag HaMatzos, but they are actually different constructs. And that appears in numerous places in Tanakh actually, but one of the clearest is here in the 6th chapter of Ezra, which we've covered recently in a shir. And this is referring to the returnees from Babylon after various negotiations and stopping and starting the building project. They now have some kind of rudimentary temple, and the text at the end of the 6th parak says, "Va'yasu v'nei hagoylo es haposach ba'arba'osi yom ba'osel hachodesh horishon." And those returnees from the diaspora, it means from Babylon, performed the Pesach, that means the Pesach offering, on the 14th of the month of the first month, because the Pesach offering was brought in the afternoon of what we call Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan. And the celebration, the festival of Pesach, Chag HaPesach, was then. Because the Kohanim and the Levim had purified themselves as one, they were all pure, meaning they'd managed to remove their ritual impurity and therefore were in a fit ritual condition to perform these mitzvahs. And they slaughtered the Pesach for all of the returnees from the diaspora, and for their brother Kohanim for themselves. And the Bnei Yisrael who returned from the exile, from the diaspora, they ate. And all of those who had separated themselves from the impurities of the lands of the other nations upon them to seek out the Lord God of Israel. Meaning that those who had gone through the appropriate purification rituals, having now left Eretz Amamim, the rabbis require people to go through a purification ritual. All those, they all celebrated and participated in this great Korban Pesach, the first since the returnees returned to the land of Israel. And then it says, Vayasu Chag Matzos Shivas Yomim B'Simcha. And then afterwards, that means after the first night, they now celebrated, they performed the festival of Matzahs for 7 days, B'Simcha, in rejoicing. Ki Simchom Hashem, because the Lord had made them rejoice, and had made the heart of the king of Ashur favourable towards them, because he had authorised the return. How so? By strengthening their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. It's very clear here that the Pesach celebration is the 14th. There was Matzah, that goes with that. And then there's a 7-day we call Chag HaMatzahs. Actually, you can see this throughout Tanakh. But here's a final suggestion. Chag HaPesach is a replica of the experience in Egypt. It requires Matzah, otherwise it isn't an authentic replica. That's why there's a conversation about, well, is there really an obligation even without the Pesach offering? And the Torah needs to have a separate verse. Say, no, you should eat matzah even when you haven't got a Korban Pesach, because that's how you're going to recall that moment of Exodus, the Korban Pesach. Then follows, beginning almost immediately and incorporated in it, the 7-day festival of Matzah. This is a more relaxed festival. It's a continuation. It's a celebration of redemption. It's a festival of Exodus and redemption. And some of the tropes from the Korban Pesach continue into it. Of course, you're not allowed to eat chometz. You have to have certain types of foods. There are certain festival days on the 1st and the 7th day. But what also goes with that is the opportunity to eat matzah for those who wish. If they wish to, because they're on a certain spiritual level or it's meaningful for them, although it's not strictly obligatory, the Torah provides them with an instrument, eating matzah, which enables them to celebrate Chag HaMatzah, which is really the festival of the original matzahs, the original lack of risen foods. They bring their food out with them and they have to eat it en route. To replicate that, which is not a strict obligation but an option, is why Chag HaMatzahs is associated with the mitzvah Rishuyos, the optional mitzvah of eating matzah, and Chag HaPesach is associated with the absolute obligation, the chova of achilas matzah, to replicate as much as possible the experience as they left Egypt long ago. Thank you.